Good evening and welcome to the latest installment of Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy Distinguished Diplomat Interview Series. Our distinguished guest today began his memorable career as a lawyer and as a scholar. He has occupied several political posts in his native Cyprus, rising from being municipal city councillor to becoming his country's Minister of Foreign Affairs as well as Minister of Finance. As European Commissioner for Health and Consumer Protection, he oversaw the introduction of a policy of mandatory health warnings on tobacco products and explored the possibility of a wide-scope EU-wide smoking ban. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome one of the most accomplished European statesmen in recent memory, His Excellency Markos Kyprianou. Your Excellency, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us here today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me.
It's an absolute pleasure. With your permission, I would like to ask you a few questions about diplomacy and the future of diplomacy.
Of course.
Your Excellency, why does diplomacy matter today? And why do we still need diplomats?
Well, as long as there are interactions between different countries, whether in a positive way, in an effort to have agreements and trade deals or agreements on political cooperation, or in the opposite way, to avoid conflicts and crises and wars, there is always a need for diplomacy, and of course the diplomats are the ones who are carrying it out. As the saying goes, when the diplomats stop talking, the guns start shooting. So it's extremely important not just to enhance the relations between countries, but also to avoid conflicts and crises in the future. No matter how the world evolves, no matter how the global situation changes, there will always be the need for the diplomats to lead international affairs.
Absolutely. Which leads me to my next question. What are the most significant ways that tomorrow's diplomats need to be adapted to that differ from today's diplomats in terms of skills and prowess and otherwise?
Two areas I would say that are changing, evolving. One is that we live in the era of speed. Everything's happening very fast. In the old days, maybe not today, but in the old days, you would send a letter. By the time the letter was received, it gave time to think, prepare. By the time you sent back the reply, things moved in a slower way. So there was always more. There were more possibilities of preparing and taking decisions. Now, in the era of electronic communications, things move so fast that there is the responses as well of governments and countries. So there is more demand on diplomats now to be more alert, to be ready much earlier, and be able to advise his or their principals, to advise them how to respond. There's no time to think as there was in the past. The second thing is that international relations, or let me rephrase that, decisions regarding international relations are very much affected nowadays by public opinion, media, NGOs. In the past, international relations, whether bilateral or multilateral, were really the domain of the governments. It was decided by the politicians or the officials at their level, negotiated with their counterparts of different countries, and that would be the end of it. Now the public is more aware and more involved. So they have to be taken into account in anticipation of what the other side's position is going to be. And that means a lot of research, a lot of studying, and a lot of preparation.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Your Excellency. Well, you've mentioned some very important characteristics and skills that diplomats need to have in order to perform their jobs properly. But what skills and characteristics do you think they most commonly lack?
One thing that I think is very important, and I don't think enough emphasis is given. Okay, I will say two things. The first one is to be properly prepared, as just mentioned earlier. It's not enough now to just read what the topic is, whether it's a trade agreement or negotiation on double taxation avoidance. Now you have to look into all the surrounding circumstances that could affect the decision or the position of your interlocutor. So the diplomat nowadays has to look behind the interlocutor and see how the decision is going to be affected. And not many spend the time to do that. They have to dedicate the effort, not just superficially to look what the topic is and maybe check the numbers, but look also the politics behind it. And so that's the one thing. And the second thing are personal relations. They have always been important in international affairs, in global affairs, the personal relations between leaders, ministers, ambassadors, but now it's even more important. So diplomats very often neglect that part. They do their work on the substance, which is very good and necessary, but they ignore the human factor, the personal relationship that could eventually determine how a discussion or negotiation evolves. And I think more emphasis, more time has to be dedicated on that, on cultivating friendship. I can even call it friendships in international relations.
Absolutely, absolutely, Your Excellency. And already you've given us such excellent and very meaningful advice. But what if you could summarize one key message for anyone starting out in a diplomatic career? What would that one key message be?
Well, I suppose I already answered that question. I would say, well, it's two things actually, and I'm repeating myself, but I think they're very important. One thing is preparedness, to dedicate the time to prepare properly, and other to devote the time to create personal relationships. These two will determine the outcome of future discussions or negotiations. These are aspects that a diplomat has to take into account now, because we're moving in a broader field than just the very narrow topic of a negotiation or discussion. Now it's more general, and there are many factors that could influence that. And I believe it's very important for the diplomat to be prepared for all possibilities. And I will say that will be another thing, that one skill they will need, especially in negotiations, will be to learn how to improvise and be flexible. No matter how much training they do, no matter how many books they read, no two negotiations are the same. Each one evolves in a very different way. It's the subject matter, the people involved, the countries involved, the circumstances. So you cannot go with just a rule book or a manual and think you can deal with the situation. So they have to be confident, and they have to be able to improvise, be flexible, and adjust and adapt to the specific situation.
Absolutely, Your Excellency. Very valuable feedback. Can you share with us an example of successful diplomacy that you have personally witnessed? And can you please tell us what, in your eyes, made it so effective?
I can give one example from my personal experience, which may not sound very important, but believe me, it was. It was my negotiations, European Commissioner, with the Russian Federation to avoid a ban on imports of beef from Europe to Russia, which it may sound not very exciting as a topic, but it, of course, concerns millions of euros of value of trade. And it took a lot of personal diplomacy, contacts, and I would say one of the reasons of successful outcome is that early enough I realized, and that's something I advise diplomats, to find who the ultimate decision maker is. Sometimes it may not be the minister or the leader opposite you, but be someone with a more technical position, who actually feeds the information to the negotiator. So we identify who was the person who was taking the decisions, and we convinced that person, we explained, had the meetings, convinced that person why our case was correct, and then of course he gave the green light and the problem was solved. And the second I will say, I know it's a little controversial, especially in this region, will be the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement with Iran. Despite if some people have, some reservations regarding the content, the fact that it managed to reach an agreement of all the parties involved. I believe it was a successful outcome of negotiations and of diplomacy. It's too bad that eventually it failed because the United States withdrew from the agreement. But nevertheless, it was in that case the coordination among the parties involved, willingness of sides to find a solution, and the fact that each side had some leverage on the other, and that was balanced in a proper way. So this is another thing that's needed in negotiations, in diplomacy. You have to see where the other side stands and be able to find a realistic compromise, a solution as an outcome.
Absolutely, Your Excellency. Well, you mentioned your time as European Commissioner for Health and in which you pioneered warnings on tobacco packets, and as well as you laid the foundation for a future EU-wide smoking ban. How did you manage to get 27 countries, all of them, to agree on such a sensitive topic?
Well, it took discussions, to be honest, but of course, exactly because it's a sensitive issue, I think it was the right time, to be fair. Both the health systems of the member states needed to, or the other way, I could not afford to keep receiving all these patients that suffer from avoidable, preventable diseases and illnesses because of smoking. At the same time, the lobbying power of the tobacco industry was very low, and they didn't have the influence they used to have in the past. So, and each member state, for their own reasons, wanted to deal with this problem, whether it was for insurance reasons or for protection of labor reasons. So the combination of these, and mind you, we did not in the end adopt European legislation because there were issues of competence there, but each member state on their own, based on different legislations, decided to move on. It did help, I have to say, that Ireland was the first country to adopt it on their own, and it was so successful that many of the concerns of other countries, especially from the entertainment industry, hospitality industry, that the pubs will close, the restaurants will not have guests, clients and customers, it are all proven unfounded concerns. So this helped. If you have an example in your hands to demonstrate that there's no reason to be worried, it helps a lot. And I think things were just falling in place. What is an issue, though, and I have to say that, the level of implementation in the member states. Some member states are stricter and enforce it much better than others, especially after the pandemic, economic crisis. They try to turn a bit of a blind eye on this issue. But I think eventually they will conform as well.
Absolutely. Very monumental work, Your Excellency. I'm sure that has helped the lives of millions of people. Taking it back to your own country, Cyprus has been a very effective player on the international arena over the years and has maintained close relations with many of the more bigger international powers. Cyprus being very comparable to the UAE in size and in effect in the international community, what is your advice to have an influential foreign policy strategy if you were to advise a smaller country the size of Cyprus and the UAE?
Well, first of all, you need to have presence, which means embassies. And as a smaller country, it's always an issue and an issue of debate, but how much budget we dedicate in diplomacy and foreign affairs, because it's not something tangible. Your citizens don't see the benefits. That's immediate direct. It's not like building a road or building a school or a hospital. So that's something that benefits the country, but it's not easy to see that. But it's important to dedicate the necessary budget and funding that is needed. So presence, one point. The second, I would say, is very important, is to have visibility. not just have an embassy for the sake of the embassy, that the ambassador meets only with its diplomat colleagues and that's it. You need to be visible in the country, in each country where you have the embassy. And the third, I would say, is to take into account of the public opinion in the country. It's not enough just to have your meetings at the government level, but in most countries it's also important to appeal and gain over the public opinion. And that's the third way you have to do. And if you have a just cause, actually, you can achieve that. So these are three factors that are very, very helpful. Having said that, it's becoming more and more difficult to maneuver between different conflicting blocs and superpowers. So that will take, again, a lot of diplomacy, I was saying earlier, a lot of skills to do that. And one has to dedicate the effort to explain the country's position and promote it at the different decision-making levels.
Absolutely, Your Excellency. Over the course of our conversation, we've covered many of the more instrumental and monumental moments of your career. You have held many crucial positions, both on the EU level and in your country, since the age of 26, a very young age. Being, of course, Minister of Finance and Minister of Foreign Affairs and an EU Commissioner. But what would you say is the most rewarding position that you have held in your entire career so far, and which was the most challenging one?
I would start with the challenging one, was, I would say, Foreign Minister, for the reason you mentioned exactly a moment ago. Coming from a smaller country, with being a member of the European Union, but with very close relations, even closer, one could even say, with countries outside the European Union, to be able to balance, and even especially when two friendly countries were having problems with each other, to be able to balance on that was the big challenge. Larger countries don't care so much about that. I call it the arrogance of the superpower. They don't need to develop diplomacy. They're too strong and too big to care about these nuances. Smaller countries have to be able to maneuver, as I said earlier, and keep a balanced position. So it was always a challenge how to maintain this balanced position, stick on principles, follow the European policies to where we belong and we participate, but also keep a balanced approach towards other countries, especially in the region of Cyprus. As for rewarding, I would say it would be as European Commissioner, coming from a small country, suddenly to represent the European Union it was something both challenging and rewarding as well. It reminds me when I became Health Commissioner, I met with my American counterpart, and he was surprised that I left the ministry. I was my Minister of Finance before to become Commissioner. He said, "Why did you leave the minister, became a Commissioner?" I said, "Well, it's the difference between 1 million people and 500 million people." As a Commissioner, I was representing and promoting the interest, protecting the interest, I would like to say, of 500 million citizens on crucial issues, of course. We had one crisis after the other. We're just getting out of the mad cow disease, and then we got the bird flu, if you remember the big crisis with avian flu. And then we had the various threats of the bans from Russia, the various imports, and then we had crisis with Brazil. And so it was always a constant problem-solving period, which whenever we solved the problem was actually rewarding and felt, I would say, satisfaction in this respect.
Absolutely, Your Excellency. And I can say, of course, as a diplomat in training, your career and their highlights has been a major source of inspiration for myself.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for joining us today.